It's a pleasure to have the chance to tell you a bit about my research. I guess the reason I didn't get to do it last year is because I was giving the presentation on foli and fumonisin, and this presentation is about another mycotoxin or fungal toxin that's common in our food supply, and that is aflatoxin. So this talk is going to be about how I was interested in how aflatoxin regulations in different parts of the world affect how we trade foods that commonly look like that. Basically, if you see corn or peanuts or nuts that look like this, you probably have seen corn that looked somewhat like this before. I hope you did not eat it, because that is highly contaminated with aflatoxin, which is a potent liver carcinogen. We were interested in seeing whether, if we could determine how aflatoxin regulations affected how food was being traded around the world, we could get a sense of where all this aflatoxin contaminated maize and pistachios are winding up around the world. First, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. A number of them were my students at University of Pittsburgh and also at Michigan State University, as well as other faculty at Pitt. And we were supported by 2 National Institutes of Health institutions, as well as the USDA, for this research. First, I'll give you a little bit of background on aflatoxins. So now we're moving largely from the nutrition side of ILSI North America, FNSP, to the toxicology side. And I'll describe what aflatoxin does in the human body and also in animals, and how we have attempted to control it via top-down methods, that is, setting regulatory standards for allowable aflatoxin in food, versus bottom-up methods. How can we actually reduce the amount of aflatoxin in our maize and our peanuts and other crops? Then I'll describe the tangled web, that anytime one nation makes a particular regulatory standard on aflatoxin in food, that actually has a ripple effect across the entire network of trade of the foodstuff. However, being part of a social network, being part of this web of food trade definitely has its benefits. And that's going to be the last part of my talk. I'm going to be talking about what happens if we completely remove trade. And there's actually an example of this that occurred in China from 1940 to 1980. I'll describe to you the consequences of that removal of the social network and increases in liver cancer and what has happened since 1980. So it's going to end on a note of hope. So first, some background on aflatoxin. What you see up here in the right is the molecular structure of aflatoxin B1, which is the most toxic of the known aflatoxins. This is a mycotoxin or fungal toxin that's produced by the fungi Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus parasiticus. These tend to be warm weather fungi, so where you find aflatoxin most commonly is in the crops maize, peanuts, tree nuts such as pistachios and almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts, macadamia nuts, any of those types of nuts, cottonseed, which is important for feed for dairy cattle, and various spices. And these are most common in sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of South Africa, South and Southeast Asia, including Eastern China, and also is perennially a problem here in the southern U.S. in the corn and the peanuts and the cottonseed that are produced here. Aflatoxin has been classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, as a Group 1 human liver carcinogen. That is, we have epidemiological proof and toxicological proof that aflatoxin causes liver cancer in humans. What we also know is that aflatoxin is synergistic with chronic infection with a hepatitis B virus. So if you happen to be chronically infected with hepatitis B or hepatitis C, as we actually know now, and you are consuming high levels of aflatoxin such that it's detectable in your blood, then you have up to a 60-time greater risk of developing liver cancer over your lifetime than an individual who is not chronically infected with hepatitis and also has lower levels of aflatoxin exposure. To give you a sense of the scale of the problem, there's close to 500 million people worldwide that are chronically infected with hepatitis B, roughly 170 million that are chronically infected with hepatitis C, and 4.5 billion people who are chronically exposed to uncontrolled aflatoxin in their food. This is most dangerous for people who consume large amounts of maize and peanuts. Other adverse health effects associated with aflatoxin exposure in the diet include immune system dysfunction, stunting in children, and acute liver failure, such as has happened many times actually in Africa, most recently in Kenya in 2004, 2005, and 2010, where there were sky-high levels of aflatoxin in the maize, and that resulted in several hundreds of deaths. As for the liver cancer cases that are caused by aflatoxin, that's on the order of several hundreds of thousands of cases per year around the world, and that makes up to 25% of the liver cancer cases in general around the world. So suffice it to say, aflatoxin is a major global food safety risk. In addition to the human health losses associated with aflatoxin, there are a number of economic losses associated with aflatoxin contamination of food as well. Close to $1 billion per year spent in the United States as far as rejected maize and peanuts and losses due to compromised livestock and poultry production. It's also been estimated that the research and development costs to try to counteract these effects of aflatoxin are up close to $50 million per year. And you can see that the costs are pretty high in other parts of the world too, where these types of analyses have been done. Aflatoxin is just causing a lot of food-related losses and export market losses. So how can we get rid of this problem of aflatoxin in our food supply? Well, in this particular diagram, you might think that what you want to try to minimize is the economic impact of aflatoxin in the food, that we don't have to throw away as much, and we're also not feeding it to cause all kinds of productivity losses and health losses. And we also want to minimize liver cancer incidence. How can we control it? We can control it from a top-down perspective by applying aflatoxin standards. How much is allowable? How much aflatoxin is allowable in our maize and our peanuts and our pistachios and almonds? Or via bottom-up methods. How can we control aflatoxin in the field or in storage? What are dietary interventions that can help us negate the adverse effects of aflatoxin, and vaccinating people against hepatitis B? So let's start first with top-down methods. So looking at regulatory standards first. Over 100 nations around the world have regulatory standards for maximum allowable aflatoxin in our food supply. But as you can see from just this small subset of nations, those standards are literally and figuratively all over the map. On the one hand, you have parts of the world like the European Union that has the strictest aflatoxin standard in food. They only allow 4 micrograms of aflatoxin for every kilogram of maize. Their standards for peanuts and for tree nuts are slightly different. That was revised in 2010. I'll go into that more later. On the other hand, you have countries like Ghana, where there is a lot of maize and peanut consumption, and there's actually no national regulation for allowable aflatoxin in food in Ghana. The US FDA regulates aflatoxin at an action level of 20 micrograms total aflatoxin per kilogram of food. Now, we were interested in understanding how these different aflatoxin regulatory standards affect food trade around the world. Let me give you a little bit of background now on network models. You've probably heard a lot about them. They have their basis in a type of math called graph theory. A network model is simply a collection of nodes, individual points, that are joined in pairs by lines if the two nodes have some sort of relationship with each other. One example could be that each of us in the room right now is a node as a person, and there might be a line connecting us if we are friends or if we've ever co-authored a paper together. A network model that you're very familiar with are road maps, where individual cities are the nodes and they're joined by roads, of course, if there's a road connecting two cities. And as well, you could make a network model of trade, how food is flowing between, or food or other commodities are flowing between two different nations all around the world. Network models are useful in that pictorially, if you develop one, you can find all kinds of trends that a simple, straightforward linear analysis might not be able to detect. For example, do trade clusters emerge if you design a trade network model? If drought or some sort of plant disease hits one particular nation, which other nations are the most likely to be affected because the food supply is going to go down in that particular nation? And then how do food safety regulations affect global trade patterns? So we developed this for 2 different crops, these network models, maize and pistachios, what we did was to gather trade data from all around the world of maize and of pistachios in the years inclusive that you see here. This was data that we got from the United Nations Commodities Trade Database for every single year. Who's importing or exporting maize and pistachios and how much between different pairs of countries. We developed the global network models for trade for every year, as well as compiling the information for maize across an entire decade. And then we determined the impact of aflatoxin regulations in those different countries on trade patterns. We did this all in a software package called PIEC, which is the Slovenian word that means spider web, because what you end up with are network models that look a bit like a spider web with some very large spiders or insects in this particular network. So let me just show you what we found here. This is the network for maize trade around the world when we were trying to minimize distances as far as countries that were trading maize with each other. The size of each of these circles is roughly proportional to the amount of maize that that country exports. It's actually the square root because by far the United States is the largest exporter of maize around the world, over 50% of the maize being exported around the world. And the directionality of the arrow shows where the maize is flowing. Here's an example of the United States exporting maize to Mexico. So what we see in this particular graphic is that there are three distinctive trading clusters as far as maize. On the right side, you have the United States, the largest exporter of maize, that's exporting maize to a number of countries throughout North America, Central America, and also South America and the Middle East that are hardly getting any of their maize from any other countries. This is what we call a star-shaped topology in network analysis. Clear on the other side over here are all the European Union countries that are basically doing no significant trade with the United States at all, which is quite interesting. They're trading with each other, and both of our groups are trading with Brazil, Argentina, and China. So this is kind of interesting because this seems to defy geographical location. Europe is not sourcing a lot of its maize from the US, it's sourcing a lot of its maize from Brazil and Argentina. Is it because of GMOs? Well, not really, because Brazil and Argentina are planting a lot of genetically modified corn as well. So what's going on here? Well, a few of the things that are revealed in that type of model. The US, as I showed you, is at the center of this star-shaped cluster, and that's actually a vulnerable part of the social network model. Because the nations that have a lot of maize consumption that are importing almost exclusively from the US are vulnerable to any supply changes of US maize. And we saw this in the case between the years from 2004 to 2007 when we were taking a lot of our maize and using it to produce ethanol. Well, in those years, particularly leading up to 2007, what that resulted in was increasing food prices because now we weren't exporting as much maize and we also weren't donating as much maize. In fact, in 2007, there were riots in 22 nations due to the higher food prices, resulting in a number of deaths. And 19 of those 22 nations were these nations that were in this particular star-shaped topology. Conversely, who is less vulnerable in this social network model? Nations that are well-connected, these are all generally well-connected nations, and also nations that are somewhere in the center of the social network. By the way, this applies not just to maize trade, but to many, many different types of social network models that have been developed. And then we were interested in overlaying the question of aflatoxin standards on these different nations. What we've done here is to color code the countries in this world map by how strict their aflatoxin standard is. The darker the color of red, the stricter the aflatoxin standard. So you can see that the EU has the strictest aflatoxin standards in the world, the US the US at 20 nanograms per gram, and then more relaxed standards. And if the country is in gray, then they actually do not have an aflatoxin regulation for maize. In the case of Australia and New Zealand, they have aflatoxin regulations for peanuts, but not for maize. They don't consume a lot of maize. And although you can't see it too clearly here, what we found in this particular network is that essentially like attracts like. The countries with the strict aflatoxin standards, which are not all EU-based, are all trading with each other. The country with more relaxed standards are all trading with each other. And then you have a few that are in the middle. And you can see this even more clearly when you look at the top 20 pairs of maize trading countries. For example, the US exporting to Japan, the US exporting to Mexico, to Taiwan, to Korea, China to Korea, etc. With only these two exceptions that I've outlined in green, these pairs of countries have either identical aflatoxin standards or aflatoxin standards that don't differ by more than 5 nanograms per gram. So basically, it really is an issue of like attracts like, or and we don't really know the question of, do the countries do trade first and then deliberately harmonize their aflatoxin standards, or is it because of their aflatoxin standards that they're doing more trade with each other? We tried to answer that question by looking at another crop, pistachios. Now, the interesting thing about pistachios is that maybe some of you are very high pistachio consumers. I personally am not. So I was really surprised to learn that in some parts of the world, pistachios contribute 45% of the aflatoxin in human diets. And this is particularly among the what WHO refers to as the Eastern Mediterranean countries, the countries that border the Mediterranean Sea as well as Middle Eastern countries. There's a lot of pistachio consumption, and there's a lot of aflatoxin in pistachios. Right now, the global market for pistachios is dominated by Iran and the United States. Iran makes up 50% of the pistachio export market, and in the US, we make up 25%. So we were interested in studying whether nations differentially import from Iran versus the United States and whether aflatoxin regulations play a role. So we were looking first at the European Union, which is a major importer of pistachios. So we gathered some interesting statistics here, basically looking over time from 1996 to 2010. The European Union used to import mostly Iranian pistachios as designated by this green line. The reason that there's a dip here in 1997 is that there were extremely high levels of aflatoxin found in consignments of pistachios coming from Iran, up to 400 nanograms per gram, which is very dangerous. If you consume that stuff, you actually could get acute liver failure and die. And so after seeing 2 such consignments, the EU basically banned all pistachio imports from Iran in that particular year. So this is the trend of how the EU has been importing Iranian pistachios, and this is how the EU has been importing American pistachios. What you see in these blue bars are the number of rejections of consignments by the EU coming from Iranian pistachios in the blue versus US pistachios in the orange. Now, what's causing these particular trends? Like I mentioned, we developed network models for every single year from 1996 to 2010, and I'm going to show you just a subset of them. In 1996, Iran was the major exporter to the European Union and worldwide. The other neat thing that you can do with a PIEC is that the size of the arrow, or the thickness of the arrow, can show the amount of the trade. So the Iran is exporting to the European Union and separately to Germany, because Germany, separate from the EU, was also importing a lot of pistachios for distribution elsewhere around the world. In the US, not nearly as much as Iran. But then in 1997, because of those 2 sky-high levels of aflatoxin in consignments, you can see that Iran does not appear to have any market benefit as far as where they're exporting their pistachios. By the time of 2003, you can already begin to see the market changing, that now the US is exporting a lot more pistachios to the European Union, and Iran is beginning to find other markets. The United Arab Emirates, you've got Hong Kong here, so it's still doing some trade with the European Union. And by the time of 2009, now the EU is getting almost all of its pistachios from the United States, and Iran has really found its other export markets in the United Arab Emirates and Hong Kong. Now, it's worthwhile to say that the average levels of aflatoxin in US pistachios is typically less than 15 micrograms per kilogram, whereas when it was measured in Iran, I guess in the last aflatoxin report of the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives of FAO and WHO, the average was 64 micrograms per kilogram, so 15 versus 64. There's a huge difference in the amount of aflatoxin in the pistachios coming from these two countries. And the EU, which has the strictest standards, is importing mostly from the United States. So we see how when we're regulating aflatoxin from the top down, essentially the countries that have the strictest aflatoxin standards are going to be purchasing the highest quality food. And the food that has the higher levels of aflatoxin are going to the countries that have relaxed or non-existent aflatoxin standards. In addition to regulations, however, how can we reduce aflatoxin exposures from these different methods? Because what we also did find, and I didn't include it in a separate slide, is that unfortunately it is the poor food exporting nations that are also receiving all of the contaminated food. What can they do on the ground? Fortunately, there are a number of different interventions that can help to reduce aflatoxin levels as well as other mycotoxin levels in the food supply. At the pre-harvest level, we can genetically enhance plants' resistance to the conditions that predispose them to fungal infections, such as drought, excessive heat, and insect damage. Good agricultural practices, planting the right type of hybrid or cultivar in the right type of geographic location, making sure that the plants are well watered and the pests are treated. And also biocontrol methods, applying strains of Aspergillus flavus, for example, that don't produce aflatoxin on the fields to outcompete the strains that do produce aflatoxin. At the post-harvest level, sorting out the individual kernels, the maize kernels or the nut kernels that are obviously moldy can remove almost all of the aflatoxin in an entire lot. Sometimes you can see very clearly that there are certain kernels, for example, in corn on the cob or in peanuts that you might buy that are obviously shriveled and moldy. If you just remove those, then that actually makes your food supply a lot cleaner and a lot safer. Improved drying methods. Fungi tend to love moisture, so if you can dry the food, it's less likely that the fungi will develop. And also improved food storage conditions. Sufficiently low temperature, keep pests out of the food, etc. But then suppose you're in a situation where you're sitting in front of a plate of food and you know that the food has aflatoxin in it. Then what can you do to counteract the adverse effects? Eat your greens, garlic, or ground. And what I mean by this is that there are agents in food or even in soil that can actually help to bind aflatoxin in your gastrointestinal tract. And these include certain kinds of clays, certain types of silicon clays that are present in soil, as well as chlorophyll in leafy green vegetables. These can also absorb aflatoxin in the gut. These have to be consumed at the same time as the meal that has the aflatoxin in order to have that effect. Then there are certain types of vegetables that can actually induce phase 2 enzymes in the liver that can help to detoxify aflatoxin. And these include the compounds in cruciferous vegetables as well as allium vegetables, that is in the onions and garlics and leeks family, as well as naturally occurring triterpenoids, such as are found in rosemary, thyme, and apple peels. Anything that can help to reduce inflammation in the liver can also help to reduce the risk of liver cancer caused by aflatoxin, including the polyphenols found in green tea. And finally, vaccinating individuals against hepatitis B so that you get rid of that synergistic impact of aflatoxin in the diet and chronic inflammation in the liver. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the last one, which is increasing dietary diversity, because so far, this, to our knowledge, is the only example we've seen of an intervention that actually reduces liver cancer that's caused by aflatoxin in any population in the world. And I'm going to be focusing on one particular case study in China for this. I mentioned earlier about some of the potential adverse effects of this network model of trade, of all of the contaminated food going to particular countries. But having a trade network at all is actually very beneficial. And this is going to be a story of how when the government of this particular country removed the trade network, that actually resulted in a lot of illness. In China, from 1940 to 1980, there was a socialist agrarian policy that dramatically limited the food trade network. Essentially, the government had declared that every county in China had to be self-sufficient in food production. They were not allowed to trade food with neighboring counties. And some countries were not, and even though the staple mostly among the eastern coast of China was used to consuming a lot of rice, except for in the very north, after this particular regime came into place, there were a lot of places that couldn't plant rice, and so they turned to planting maize, which has relatively much higher aflatoxin levels. But that all changed in 1980 when the agrarian policy was relaxed. Now counties were allowed to trade with each other. Liver cancer mortality declined in one particular part of the country because of less aflatoxin exposure. This is work that we published in Cancer Prevention Research. And that particular part of China is Qidong County. It has 1.2 million residents, and it's right above the city of Shanghai on the eastern coast of China. So Qidong is part of the larger Jiangsu province. And what you see by the different colors are liver cancer mortality rates. So the darker the square, the more liver cancer mortality there was. So you could see in the 1970s, there was a huge amount of liver cancer mortality in this one little tip of China. And if you go out a little bit further, there's hardly any liver cancer mortality, whereas here, 1 in 10 men under the age of 45 were dying of liver cancer. So what was causing that? Well, as you can see, actually, from this map, Qidong is going right into the sea. If you want to plant rice, you actually have to have borders around your rice paddy. You can't just have it going straight into the sea. So they could not plant rice, and they could not import rice from neighboring counties. So they planted corn, maize. Unfortunately, since it was very moist conditions, the amount of Aspergillus flavus infection in that maize planted in Qidong County was extremely high, and the aflatoxin levels were extremely high. Here is the US standard again for allowable aflatoxin in food, 20 micrograms per kilogram, and most of the time we don't encounter nearly this much in the maize we have in the United States, whereas in Qidong, almost all of the maize had above this level that the US regards as safe. Hence, you could see the extremely high liver cancer incidence in this one particular part of China. But in 1980, when China relaxed its agrarian socialism, what happened? The Qidongese rushed out to buy rice from neighboring Haimen County. By 1987, most of the Qidongese were finally consuming rice again. By 1998, there weren't that many Qidongese that were eating any maize at all, and by the year 2012, they were hardly consuming any maize. What happened to aflatoxin levels as measurable in the blood by the aflatoxin albumin adduct? It went down steadily from 1982 to 2012. This is a sample of 100 samples taken from the Qidong Liver Cancer Institute stores of blood. Guangxi and Hezuo, Guangxi is actually not part of Qidong, but this is another part of China where there were also comparable aflatoxin exposure levels. So basically, it just keeps on going down. And what happened as a result of this? Aflatoxin exposure decreased roughly 40-fold. Liver cancer incidence decreased by 45% just from the 1980s to 2012. And we think that this liver cancer mortality rate is going to go down even further because we haven't even recognized yet all of the benefits of taking aflatoxin out of the diet. We know for sure that it's not because the HPV vaccine came to this part of China, because actually infants weren't even being vaccinated against HPV until 2002, and they weren't the ones dying of liver cancer anyway. So we can rule out HPV vaccination as a cause for the liver cancer decline. We've looked at other types of risk factors for liver cancer as well, but those were realized before 1980, before all of this decline in liver cancer rates. So we think we can say pretty definitively it's because of people shifting from eating a lot of maize to eating a lot of rice, and population liver cancer decreased dramatically. When we presented these results, other individuals were asking us, well, what about Africa? There's a lot of aflatoxin there too, a lot of liver cancer being caused by aflatoxin in maize and peanuts. Well, there wasn't the same policy in place as there was in China, so I wouldn't recommend the exact same type of intervention. However, we can think about how we can either increase dietary diversity amongst different populations where possible within sub-Saharan Africa, or switch staple crops altogether. So what are some of the indigenous crops to Africa? There's sorghum, millet, various types of legumes, fonio, which is being referred to as the new quinoa because of all of its nutritional qualities, teff in northeastern Africa, and rice, certain varieties that are native to Africa. These do have some potential problems. Maybe the yields are not as high as maize. Maybe it doesn't taste as good. However, these crops are rarely infected with aspergillus, and so they don't tend to have much aflatoxin. So to conclude, aflatoxin causes a large burden of disease worldwide and also has significant economic costs. Food safety regulations are one way of dealing with aflatoxin problems, and they tend to have ripple effects in the global web of food trade. Namely, what we see are that nations trade more with other nations that have identical or similar food safety standards, regardless of geographic barriers. And that at least what we've shown in one part of the world is that liver cancer can decline dramatically in a population when you switch from a lot of people eating a foodstuff that has a lot of aflatoxin to another foodstuff that doesn't have much aflatoxin. So long-term solutions should focus on switching to staple crops that are less infected with aspergilli or increasing dietary diversity. Thank you.
The numbers that you reported, were they in raw pistachios or roasted pistachios?
Oh, so that's a very good question. Roasting has some effect in reducing aflatoxin, but not very much. And those particular levels that I was reporting of the 15 versus the 64 micrograms per kilogram were in unfinished pistachios.
And then what about the impact of salt in terms of?
Salt has no effect on reducing aflatoxin.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I was wondering if anyone's followed up on the effects of hepatitis V vaccinations, particularly in countries in Africa where the aflatoxin burdens are quite high. Is there demonstrable proof that people are really getting less cancer even though they're exposed to the aflatoxin?
That's a very good question. So HPV vaccination has been introduced to many African countries through Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccination and Immunization. The issue with HBV is that if you're chronically infected with hepatitis B, you typically don't develop liver cancer until maybe about 50 years after you first acquired hepatitis. So the benefits have not yet been seen because typically people would not have died of hepatitis yet if they were in the populations that were vaccinated. But hopefully we can see this in the future.